What's up, Rockstars? Today I'm doing a video talking to you guys about how the digital board game revolution, the idea of making things app-driven, electronic-driven, is dangerous and bad. Now, as with all things, pros and cons, I've actually already done a video on all the benefits and positive things that something like the Teburu system can bring, and I'll link down to that in the description below, so feel free to check that out. Additionally, there is a Kickstarter, or really a game found going on, where you can get the Vampire the Masquerades. It's set in Milan. It looks really, really cool, and it's something that uses the Teburu system, I think, to many of its strengths. So I'll link down to that in the description below as well, so you can see if that is a game you might be interested in. It's kind of a typically a video game or a tabletop game, so then to kind of merge the two together, kind of interesting. But I've already gone through a whole lot of positives, and there are a ton. But today we're going over the negatives. There are plenty of cons as well. Some things just are opinion-based, some are just factual. It's just the way things are, and you just have to decide how important each pro and each con is for you. So if you haven't watched the original one, I do encourage you to watch that other video. If you don't, though, and you still want to hear a little bit of an introduction on what Teburu system is, Teburu is essentially a electronic board, a board that you can place down like map tiles or anything like that on, that then has like the smart technology. It can tell where you're at, what you're doing. So your miniatures are on these little things that can detect where they are in there, and then the dice have electronics in there, so the app knows what you're like rolling and stuff, and then the app does a lot of the other work for you. So it knows what's being rolled, it knows where people are, what you're doing, stuff like that. As an example, there was a map, and I was moving around the map, and there was a little alcove that I checked, and I got an item from it. You didn't have to place a chest token down or do something like that. You just kind of knew. So that's kind of the experience that they can provide you with the Teburu system, but there are cons as well. So we're just going to go through a big list of them. There's quite a few. Consoles break. I'm viewing the Teburu system as kind of a console because it works for several different games. The second one's already being crowdfunded. There is a third one announced, the Sword and Sorcery. That's also going as well. And Hasbro just announced that they're going to be working on them as well. So it's kind of like this a machine that you buy to then play other board games, right? And so the problem is that when that console, that Teburu system breaks, if and when it does, all of those games it supports are unplayable now, not just one. It's not like you just lost a card to one game. It's now none of those games work fundamentally. You cannot play them. So that's definitely something that's kind of a bummer. If one thing breaks, everything about it is broken. There's no getting around it either because you were required to use the electronic portion of it. Glitches and bugs. They will appear like in anything, and often they can lead you to no way to proceed. This happens a lot in video games. So once you start doing the digitalization of stuff, you start getting the same issues video games have. There are things where like, oh, if you start this quest line, right now it's bugged and you can't finish it. The person doesn't appear where they're supposed to be. The prompt doesn't go or whatever. And you can get that in this. Now, in a regular board game, you could just make it up. You could just skip it. You could do whatever. But in a video or in an app-driven game like what Teburu games are, it's impossible to. It's breaking just like it would be in a video game. There's nothing you do about it. That quest is bugged. That path is wrong. That thing is incorrect. And it's not like you can just go draw the right card. It's whatever the app says that card is, right? So there's less viability to bypass any of those things. So much more of those errors then become game-breaking errors, which obviously not very good. Obviously, not exactly a positive. All right, this has already been announced. It was the very first thing that Hasbro mentioned, infinite expansions. That's right. It obviously leads to the idea that you can be able to digitally create more and more and more content and keep selling them over and over and over again to all the users. So if you thought it was hard to keep up with Shadows of Brimstone, or if you thought it was hard to keep up with stuff like Descent and stuff like that have like a huge amount of expansions and whatnot, just wait till you get a company like Hasbro that's really ready to use these digital platforms on their board games to a large degree, and be ready to buy a whole lot of DLC, whole lot of expansions, whole lot of add-ons, bonuses, all that kind of stuff. You're gonna have a laundry list of them. Sometimes you go to Steam and you'll see over 100 different options. I fully expect to see that too. Buy this character, buy this pack, buy this new item pack, buy this, buy that. Infinite expansions. It's literally the first thing they mentioned. Awesome. And along with that, they'll probably nickel and dime you too. Oh, you want this feature? Oh, well, just add solo for this amount, and just add this for this amount. And oh, you like crafting? Well, we can add crafting here again, but only for this amount. And you'll eventually be paying a little bit for a whole lot. And that ends up being a whole lot. So yeah, it'll add up pretty quick. I'm sure it's going to happen. Speaking of which, just monetization in general, ready to subscribe to a board game? Hey, you don't want to buy all those add-ons? Or maybe you want some free stuff as well? Well, you get the extra cool currency as long as you're a subscriber to Shadows of Brimstone. That's right, just play Flying Frog Games, $50 a month, and you can get all of this stuff and a special discount on all those add-ons you're still buying on top of that. Guys, it happens. It's exactly what makes companies want to go digital. It's not always a creative thing. A lot of times it's a financial thing. Steady income. There's a positive to the company to that, but there's a negative to the consumer to that as well. So yeah, I'm not looking forward to having a Hasbro subscription and a Flying Frogs Games subscription and a Chip Theory Games subscription and an Awaken Realm subscription. You get the idea? Like, that's how it starts. Like, if this is the Netflix, eventually you get Hulu and Paramount and all the other ones, Disney Plus and HBO Max, and suddenly you're subscribing to everything. Everything's a subscription. You don't just buy board games anymore. You don't even own them anymore. Now you just subscribe to them. Yeah, gonna happen. It's a matter of time. We'll see who does it first. All right, now another thing they can do is forced updates. When Descent, the third Descent came out, there was a big worry that they'd really stop Descent 2nd Edition to force it to where, like, anybody who wants to play Descent has to play the newer version. Hate to say it, but this happens all the time digitally because there's a small cost for, like, hosting servers and, you know, handling the traffic from the API requests and all that kind of stuff when it comes to doing digital content that's old. So invariably, they turn off the old stuff and start supporting the new stuff. So if you've ever heard of a video game shutting down, that's exactly what that means. And the same will happen for your board game, as they can totally be like, hey, there's this new version, and now that's the only one you can buy. You can't even get the new one again. Hey, when you want to install that app from your phone, guess what? You're not getting it back because it's not on the Play Store anymore, right? Stuff like that can definitely happen where they stop supporting or force you into the new one. They can even push an update so that if you download it, it just points you to the next one. I mean, there's tons of ways they can control it to where you have to buy something new and your old game no longer works purposefully. Now, this is kind of a big one, but they force the gameplay on you too. What do I mean by that? Well, if you've ever heard of the word house rule, then you just heard of something that's impossible otherwise. So the thing is, a lot of board games are incredibly customizable. You want to be able to do this? That's fine. You want to be able to have 7 things in the store instead of 5 things? You think 5 things is too little? Too late. Doesn't matter. You can't put 7 things because the app forces it. It's like you can tell the app, hey, put 7 things instead, even though that's not the rules. Or, hey, you don't like it to where you can possibly miss? Well, guess what? If the rules say you can miss, then you're going to miss, and there's nothing you can do outside of that. It's tracking all of everything. If you're in a big solo game and you've gone all this way and you were on 1 health left and the boss was on 1 health left and you lost, but you wanted to skip it because you felt like, you know what, that was close enough. I'm going to go ahead and skip it. I don't want to replay that boss. Too late. In the app, that's not an option. It's forcing you. You lost. You got to replay it now. There's no skipping that boss battle or undealing with that issue or something like that. I fairly recently reviewed Bloodborne, the board game, and I talked about many of the house rules that I think make that game better. If that was app driven, it'd be completely impossible. I have talked about how I customize a lot of the games I play, whether it's like Magic the Gathering, where you don't really get bad draws because I'm purposely, like making it to where the land is evenly distributed. Stuff like that you can't do. Or dumbing things down for my daughter if I'm playing with my youngest daughter and I don't want her to have a difficult time. Or she rolled and it was bad and she's really upset. And I'm like, you know what? No, you got him! Yay! Critical hit! That's exactly what you needed was 2 1s. I can do that. Not when it's app driven. They will force the gameplay on you. Additionally, they can change the gameplay on you. A little bit of a story here. I liked playing this video game. It was called The Division, and I liked playing it with a riot shield and SMG. Super cool, very fun gameplay. And all I did was play PvE, go through like these kind of dungeons like stuff and get better loot and stuff like that. And all my skills, all of my inventory, everything was spec'd towards that, and I really enjoyed it. Well, it's an online game as well, and they decided that wasn't balanced enough in PvP, so they changed the stats on it. So I log in one day, and suddenly I can't play the content I was playing before. I can't clear a dungeon. I can't do this. I'm suddenly much weaker, and I also can't even do some of the skills I was doing. I can't now move around and do stuff. And I bought the game in one state, and then they made changes to it after I bought it that now it plays differently than how I did it, and there's nothing I can do about it. I can't go back to that state. I can't make it do something else. They can force and change things after you buy it, and whether you agree with them or not, they will happen. If they change the loot table of that, if they change the difficulty of that boss, if they do this, if they do that, if they add this system that you don't like, or this grind that you don't like, or these extra things, or anything like that, you don't get a choice, you get it anyway. There's no opt-out portion of this. Fundamentally, every game that uses an app is a legacy game. And by that I mean it will die. And I'm talking long term. I'm going to talk about this a little bit, so bear with me. Eventually, architecture, like computer architecture, will change. Eventually, security patches become a thing where you can't go back. Eventually, there are things that just aren't supported anymore long term. This happens with everything. Now, a lot of you guys talk about how, like, well, you could still do like DOSBox, even play old computer games, stuff like that. The amount of people involved in, especially computer-oriented people, involved in video games and involved in board games, especially electronic board games, laughably not the same number. So if there's an entire group of people that, yeah, you can play NES ROMs, first of all, it's because there was a physical version that they could rip. They have the code, right? You can get the ROM. That's not the case with these apps. But on top of that, there's just not as many people willing to do that. Now, you could eventually get where, hey, you can, emulate Android, 3 or whatever, or what are we on now? Like, you can emulate Android 12 or 13 or 15, it doesn't matter. In the future, eventually, Android won't even make sense. Cell phones won't even make sense. I mean, we're talking eventually, that app is just not going to run or not going to run well. Even if you can emulate something, that doesn't mean everything runs well on it. So eventually, at some point, especially if you don't have the files and the actual access to it, it's just going to go away. It's just nothing about it. You will eventually never be able to play that game again. It's just how technology works. Okay, it's like assuming that you can play like a radio drama like thing where you like play stuff around it or something like that. Well, we don't listen to radios anymore like that. Okay, it just doesn't work, right? Technology moved on, and the same thing will go here. Another thing this does is it further enables developers to release unfinished, unbalanced, unplay-tested things to fix them later. The idea of patch it later will definitely be a thing. The idea of a day one patch will eventually be a thing. Essentially, it becomes where as long as they have the physical components, we can fix it later. Don't worry about it. It doesn't need to be fixed right now. We can ship it. You can ship it before it's ready, right? Minimal viable product. All that kind of stuff happens when you stop looking at a game release as in a solid thing and start looking at we can fix whatever we need afterwards. And that eventually becomes, sadly, the norm. Just inherently, it's how it works. If you can release sooner, that's what you tend to do. And so that's what every business tends to try to do. So they won't hold off on it we can announce a delay or we can release it now. It mostly works and we can fix the rest later. Typically, they're going to pick the second one. It's tried and true. We've seen it happen. One thing I find very difficult in these is sharing information with others. So one of the great things about a board game versus a video game, even a digital one, is typically you have a whole bunch of people around you. Solo, obviously, that doesn't matter, but like often you're there with a bunch of your buddies or friends or whatever, right? Friends, families, loved ones. They're there playing the board game with you, even if it's an app-driven one, which is very different from a video game. However, if I need to share information, I can typically just like lean over and show them cards or pass them the card and do that or whatever. But when it's mostly all on your phone, you have to essentially give them your whole phone, which first of all, not everybody's happy to do, but it means you're sharing everything with them. What that means is if I have my character board and I also have this little story bit and I also have my equipment here and I have these ability cards and I only want to share the ability cards, I don't have the option of having everything else here and still being able to mess with it and mess with my inventory or whatever. I have to give them everything, my whole entire access to everything I own, and then I can get it back in the mess with it. Whereas in a board game with separate components, you can share just those components. You can pass them that, you can do that, stuff like that. So that's very, very different. Additionally, helping other people out. How many times has it been where like somebody gets up to go and they're like, oh, I'm just going to like move over there and do that or whatever. And you can just kind of do that for them, or you can help them out or they need to do several things. And like, I think of Warhammer here, right? And like, oh, I'll move these units and you move those units or whatever. And you can do that. And that's a lot harder when it's digital, especially with typically only one interaction point. Just again, a limitation of the technology. I like to go to a cabin for my anniversary. It's a lovely trip up into the mountains, and we like to bring board games there because we're nerds. However, you know what gets really hard? I've heard of a lot of people that get cabin getaways, and a whole bunch of guys go up and into a cabin and play board games all day and stuff like that. Super cool. That's awesome. Good for you guys. That gets really hard if you need power and need Wi-Fi, which all these things need. So as you need more modern technology, it makes it harder to bring it out camping, bring it out up into the mountains, into the cabin, on the beach, wherever it is that you want to go, to your kind of a timeshare. I don't care what it is. You know what I'm saying? Like, moving these around and doing that becomes more difficult because you have necessary things that you need besides just the physical components. Right? You need some kind of connection to the outside world and stuff. And that's not always where people want to play board games. Now, this is something I'm going to leave you with, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this because I don't know the answer to this. I'm not sure if there is an answer to this, but if you have an opinion on it, I'd love to hear it because I think it's kind of a good gauge on where we're all kind of lining up maybe. Maybe we all do kind of line up. But at some point, as more and more things become digital, because you can have just the story. You can have the story plus the cards. You have the story plus the cards plus the dice. You can have, like, you can put it all in there to where then there are no physical components. Or, so where you draw that line kind of matters. But then when does the board game that's app driven, electronic driven, become a very expensive video game that you now have to store and set up versus a board game that's app driven? What's the difference there? Is there a difference? Where's that line? Where's that threshold where now that's not a board game, that's a video game with physical components? When they have to store on a shelf and set up, that's more expensive because of the physical components. When it could just all be digital. And when does it become something like where, oh, well, it's a board game that just happens to have this digital stuff with it? I don't know the answer to that. Again, I don't know if there even is one. It definitely sounds like a fuzzy line kind of thing. Maybe no, I know it when I see it. I'm not sure. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. But at some point, the board game just becomes a worse video game. With assuming you're playing solo. In most video games, you're not playing around other people and interacting with them. There's a few party games, stuff like that do that, but for the most part, local co-op is gone in video games. So if you're playing a video game, it's all digital, even the interaction. So there's a difference there, but when it comes to actually interacting with the game, maybe not so much. Love to hear your thoughts on that. Guys, thank you so much. Again, this is just a very negative one, but it's because there's a lot to go over. There's a lot of nuance there, and I wanted to really give each one kind of some breathing room. So I had the positive one first. This is the negative one. Pros and cons to the system. Are there more pros than cons? Are there better pros than the cons or worse cons than the pros? Love to hear your thoughts on it, especially around the Teburu system because it is active on GameFound right now. And again, that is linked down in the description below, of course. Feel free to check it out. Guys, thank you so much for your time. Love to hear your thoughts, so be sure to share those and subscribe for more. We'll have some talking points, reviews, news, unboxings, all that stuff coming up. So guys, thank you so much. Take care. Bye, guys.